Every so often in the XRP community, a piece of research appears that is simply too accurate. Not sensational, not exaggerated, but too aligned with the real forces shaping global liquidity. And when that happens, when a forecast ties XRP's trajectory directly to the mechanism of institutional settlement, it doesn't last long. It disappears. Not because it was wrong, but because it revealed something the market was not supposed to recognize yet. That's exactly what happened with the forecast we're discussing today. A projection that didn't call for a date or a moonshot, but instead connected XRP's future to the pressures building inside the global monetary system. A forecast so grounded in macro reality that it was quietly removed before most people ever saw it. Before we break down what it exposed, take 1 second to like this video so the research reaches more people who actually want clarity. Subscribe to Matrix Millionaire so you're always ahead of the headlines. And remember, nothing here is financial advice. And as of today, XRP is trading in the low $2 range. Now let's talk about why that forecast vanished. The prediction wasn't based on speculation. It was based on something far more threatening to the legacy narrative: the actual liquidity cycles that determine when value transfer systems break, when new rails must activate, and when global settlement architecture can no longer function on the old infrastructure. It was a forecast built on the real signals, the ones institutions monitor relentlessly: gold liquidity compression, violent rotations in sovereign bonds, mounting settlement delays, the rise of tokenized assets, widening cross-border volume, and the thinning of over-the-counter pathways. The forecast didn't predict XRP going up. It predicted why it must reprice when certain macro conditions align. And that is what made it dangerous. Retail investors generally think forecasts get deleted because they're wrong, irresponsible, or clickbait. But the most informative forecasts, the ones grounded in settlement mechanics and macro liquidity, are usually removed because they come too close to describing how the system actually transitions behind the scenes. This particular forecast connected XRP's future to something most influencers never mention: the moment when global liquidity no longer fits through the old settlement rails. It showed step by step how stress in gold markets forces custodians to rebalance faster, how bond volatility exposes delays that banks can no longer tolerate, and how tokenized assets create a 24-hour system that fiat rails cannot match. In other words, the forecast linked XRP's future value not to emotion, but to inevitability. And that is the kind of clarity that gets erased. The minute someone maps XRP to macro structure, not hype, not headlines, the narrative shifts. XRP stops looking like a speculative token and starts looking like what it actually is: a structural upgrade to global settlement. And institutions do not want retail understanding that relationship before the system is ready. The forecast also made one point that hit too close to the truth: that XRP's visible price is not a reflection of its real usage. It explained calmly and mathematically that most XRP utility occurs in the back end of the system, in corridors, liquidity hubs, and OTC routes that never touch a public exchange. And it warned that once these private channels reach saturation, the open market becomes the only remaining source of liquidity. That was the trigger point, the moment the forecast outlined with uncomfortable precision. Because when institutions must source XRP publicly, price is forced to converge with utility, and that is the moment the old system loses its ability to hide demand. The prediction wasn't about a particular month or quarter. It pointed to an alignment of events: gold liquidity reaching a stress threshold, bond markets exceeding settlement tolerance, tokenized assets scaling faster than fiat rails, regulatory harmonization crossing a minimum threshold, and corridor volume outgrowing OTC supply. Each of these is measurable. Each is progressing, and the forecast tied them together so clearly that it resembled insider timing, even though it was simply macro literacy. But from the outside, it looked like a leak. And that is why the forecast disappeared. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. It revealed a truth the system prefers to unfold silently: that a new settlement architecture must emerge when global liquidity outgrows the old rails, and that XRP is already positioned inside that architecture. In the next section, we're going to break down exactly what the deleted forecast identified: the underlying mechanics, the settlement pathways, and the macro pressure points that explain why the world will need XRP long before the chart admits it. To understand why this XRP forecast was deleted, you have to understand what it revealed, not about price, but about the financial system itself. Because the heart of the forecast wasn't a number or a target. It was a structural explanation of how global liquidity behaves when the old settlement rails begin to fail. And the moment you understand that structure, you see exactly why the prediction struck a nerve. Let's start with gold liquidity, because gold is the earliest warning signal in global finance. When gold markets tighten, it is not a sign of fear. It is a sign of stress inside the settlement layer. Gold is still used as collateral by institutions, and when liquidity compresses, custodians must reposition that collateral faster and more frequently. But gold does not move on modern rails. It moves slowly, through channels not built for real-time markets. This creates a mismatch that grows more dangerous as volatility rises. The deleted forecast highlighted this mismatch. It showed that when gold liquidity tightens beyond a certain threshold, banks must begin testing alternative settlement rails to reduce exposure. Those rails require a neutral bridge asset, something fast, liquid, and globally interoperable. The forecast didn't say XRP might be used. It explained why XRP must be used. That alone made it controversial. Now shift to the second pillar of the deleted research, bond market rotation. Bonds are the backbone of global liquidity. When yields shift, capital moves in massive quantities across jurisdictions in a matter of hours. But settlement doesn't happen in hours. It happens in days. During volatile periods, this delay becomes intolerable. Institutions cannot afford settlement risk when billions are repositioning at speed. The forecast mapped this reality with alarming clarity. It showed how bond volatility forces institutions into a corner, either accept settlement delays that increase exposure or adopt new rails that settle value instantly. The forecast demonstrated that as bond volatility accelerates, institutions begin quietly probing for real-time settlement pathways, and it identified the one technology suited to serve that need, XRP. This was the second reason the forecast vanished. It didn't just speculate about XRP's future utility, it demonstrated how existing macro conditions already require it. The third pressure point is tokenization, and this was the part of the forecast that likely sealed its fate. As more assets become digitized, real estate, commodities, bonds, funds, their movement becomes continuous. Tokenized assets trade 24 hours a day. They settle instantly. They operate at digital speed. But the money used to settle those assets does not. This mismatch creates systemic risk that can only be resolved by using a neutral, real-time settlement bridge. The deleted forecast highlighted this transition in detail. It compared the growth of tokenization platforms with the stagnation of settlement infrastructure, showing that the world's financial markets were already outgrowing their rails. And when rails break, systems must upgrade. The prediction didn't say XRP will moon. It said XRP will be required. That kind of clarity doesn't survive long in public view. Next, the forecast addressed Ripple's corridor architecture. It pointed out something most people overlook. Corridors are activated long before the public recognizes their impact. They begin with small value transfers, compliance alignment, liquidity tests, and routing logic, all executed behind enterprise firewalls, not public exchanges. The forecast said plainly, if you wait for public volume to confirm corridor adoption, you will be late. This struck directly at the retail belief that nothing is happening until the chart moves. The forecast showed that institutional adoption appears on the back end first and only becomes visible on the chart when over-the-counter supply can no longer absorb demand. And that brings us to the most sensitive part of the deleted research, over-the-counter thinning. The forecast mapped out how Ripple's private liquidity channels were not infinite, how institutional demand slowly consumes OTC availability, and how, at a certain point, institutions are forced into the open market. The moment OTC pathways can no longer supply the liquidity required for utility-level settlement, demand must source through public exchanges. That is the moment the chart stops reflecting retail emotion and starts reflecting institutional necessity. The forecast identified the markers leading to that moment. It identified the macro pressures accelerating it. It identified how corridor growth and regulatory alignment converge into it. It mapped out the sequence with unsettling precision. And forecasts that map the sequence look too much like timing. That is why they get removed, because they don't expose a date. They expose a mechanism. And when the mechanism is clear, the outcome becomes unavoidable. In the next section, we'll break down the psychology behind this invisibility. Why retail interprets the absence of public signals as stagnation, while institutions interpret the same silence as an opportunity to prepare for the system's next expansion phase. The most important part of this story is not the deleted forecast itself. It is what its disappearance reveals about where we actually are in the global liquidity cycle. Retail investors assume silence means uncertainty. Institutions understand silence is preparation. The back-end world moves first, the visible world moves last, and the forecasts that correctly describe this pattern often vanish because they recognize the sequence too early. The forecast didn't predict a date. It identified a structural inevitability that global liquidity is reaching a point where the old system can no longer process the volume, speed, and complexity of modern value movement. And when that happens, real-time settlement architecture is no longer an option. It becomes a requirement. That is the moment XRP becomes visible. But here is the psychological divide. Retail expects that shift to arrive with fanfare. Institutions expect it to arrive with necessity. Retail watches for price movement. Institutions watch for liquidity stress. Retail looks for announcements. Institutions look for settlement failures. And the deleted forecast recognized exactly where on that curve we are today. Gold compression is signaling the earliest stages of settlement strain. Bond volatility is testing the limits of delayed clearing. Tokenized assets are accelerating beyond fiat rails. OTC pathways are tightening. Corridors are expanding quietly. Regulation is aligning piece by piece. Every signal is pointing in the same direction. Activation through necessity. That is what the forecast exposed too clearly. It showed that price is the last indicator, not the first. It showed that XRP's real utility emerges behind the scenes, not on exchanges. And it showed that by the time the market recognizes what is happening, the infrastructure will already be carrying weight it was once only designed to test. This is why the disappearance matters. Not because the forecast was dangerous, but because it was accurate. And while most people will only understand this after the fact, you see it now. You understand the sequence, you understand the signals, and you understand that forecasts disappear not when they are wrong, but when they come too close to describing the truth before the system is ready for it. Before you go, support the research that keeps you ahead of the noise. Tap like, subscribe to Matrix Millionaire, and comment, "I saw it," if you now understand why the forecast vanished, and why its disappearance is the biggest signal of all. The silence isn't empty. It's the final stage before the system becomes visible.